In recent years, Indigenous rights and reparations have become increasingly discussed topics as countries around the world strive to recognize the injustices faced by Indigenous peoples and make amends for them. Indigenous rights refer to the rights of Indigenous peoples, including their right to self-determination, their right to cultural, religious, and linguistic identity, and their right to traditional land and resources. Reparations are payments or other forms of compensation that are provided to Indigenous peoples for the wrongs and injustices they have faced, such as colonization, land dispossession, and cultural and language suppression. Indigenous rights are based on the principle that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination and the right to maintain their traditional cultural, linguistic, and religious identity. This includes the right to determine their political status, to maintain their own governing institutions and to have access to their traditional lands and resources. Indigenous rights also extend to the right to be consulted and to have a say in decisions that affect their lives, including decisions related to land and resource management. Reparations are a way of making amends for the wrongs and injustices suffered by Indigenous peoples. These include such injustices as colonization, land dispossession, and the suppression of cultural and language. Reparations help restore justice and restore the balance of power between Indigenous peoples and the governments that have wronged them. Reparations can take many forms, including monetary payments, the return of lands and resources, and the recognition and protection of Indigenous rights. It is important to note that reparations should not be seen as a substitute for justice, but rather as a way to ensure that justice is served and that Indigenous peoples receive the compensation they deserve for the wrongs they have suffered. In many countries, Indigenous rights and reparations are still not adequately recognized or protected. In some cases, Indigenous peoples are still facing discrimination and marginalization. It is therefore essential that governments take action to ensure that Indigenous rights and reparations are respected and upheld. This can be done by acknowledging the wrongs and injustices suffered by Indigenous peoples and taking steps to rectify the wrongs and ensure that Indigenous peoples receive the reparations they are due. Governments must also ensure that Indigenous rights are respected and protected, and that Indigenous peoples are given the opportunity to participate in decision-making that affects their lives. Indigenous rights and reparations are essential to achieving lasting justice and reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and the governments that have wronged them. It is therefore important that governments take action to ensure that Indigenous rights and reparations are recognized and respected. By doing so, governments can ensure that Indigenous peoples are treated with dignity, that justice is served, and that Indigenous rights and reparations are adequately addressed.